Another important piece of the puzzle in understanding how children pick up new words is the communicative intent of the adults around them. In other words, the adults around them have to be intending to communicate something with the child in order for the child to pick up on the new words. If the adults are just like making pointless noises or talking about things that are clearly outside of the infant sphere, then presumably the infant will just kind of ignore what's going on. They might be processing some of that language in the background, but they're not trying really hard to process what's not being intentionally communicated to them. Now, some early researchers wondered if young children would pick up new words through a process of associative learning. Now, you've undoubtedly encountered this idea in other psychology classes where you've learned about Pavlov's dogs. Before associative conditioning, the dog would salivate in the presence of food, but if you rang a bell, then there was no salivatory response. During conditioning, the bell and the food would be paired together. The dog would, of course, salivate in response to the food, but not really in response to the bell. But because of the pairing together of these two things, a dog would eventually salivate in response to the bell alone. Some people wondered if this is how children learn language. If you say a word and you say it in the presence of a particular object, will just the pairing of that word and the object together result in learning the word? In order to investigate this, researchers designed an experiment where a disembodied speaker in the ceiling would just repeat sentences like this, while toddlers would play with their toys. Danu! It's a Danu! That disembodied voice was not an individual clearly intending to communicate with a child. And so later on, when they would engage in some of these eye gaze tasks to figure out what young children had learned, they might say, "Where's the Danu?" And the child would not be any better equipped to look at the Danu after having heard, "It's a Danu," over the speaker. This suggests that children are not learning new words by classical conditioning. If you just teach them through this kind of associative process, they won't learn anything. Remember the TED Talk we watched a few days ago? We learned then that children won't pick up a new language just from listening to an audio recording, or even if they watch somebody teaching them words and sentences in that foreign language on a television. The person has to be right there live with them in order for the child to pick up the new language, the new sounds of that language. So in future research, they investigated whether an individual in the same room as the child, pointing to the object, could say something like, "Danu, it's a Danu," and if the child would be equipped to understand that sentence referred to the object. And indeed, children were really good at picking up the new word and understanding that this object is in fact called a Danu. Interestingly, however, if you put an adult in the room looking at a different object than the child is looking at, like in this case, the adult is looking at a slinky, then the child will look up when the adult is speaking. Danu, it's a Danu. They'll look up, see what the adult is doing, what they're engaged with, and recognize that the toy I'm playing with is not a Danu. The toy the adult is playing with is a Danu. Things are different, though, if the child has autism. Autism spectrum disorder is a neurological condition that it impairs the ability to coordinate attention with another person or to make inferences about someone else's state of mind. So these kids are kind of self-absorbed. It's really difficult for them to make eye contact and to understand what other people might be thinking and feeling. It's just kind of like a social relationship disorder. When researchers did this same study here with kids on the spectrum, the children assumed that the word the adult was saying was referring to the object they were playing with, rather than the one that the experimenter was actually looking at and playing with themselves. It's easy to see how a failure to check like what the speaker might be talking about could lead to some instability in word meanings. For example, if you have autism and you happen to be looking at a duck the first time you heard somebody say, "Look at the bicycle," and maybe the next time you're looking at the lint between your toes, and then the next time you actually happen to be looking at the bicycle when you hear that word, and then you can imagine that would be really confusing sorting out what a bicycle is, because you aren't sure if it means the lint between your toes or an actual bicycle or a duck or anything else. So I guess then it's not really that surprising that children who are on the autism spectrum might have some significant language impairment. There are so many things in the environment that a speaker could be talking about. So if you can see what the speaker's communicative intent is, then this can filter out all the other possible word meanings and just narrow it down to the thing that the adult is talking about at that time. This researcher at the University of Washington did a study in which they tried to investigate eye tracking and mutual gaze in young toddlers at around the age of 10.5 months. So this baby here is somewhere between 10 and 11 months, and the researcher would, sitting across from the table, make eye contact with the baby, and then avert her gaze and look toward a toy across the room. The baby, in response, would also look in the same direction as the experimenter to see what the experimenter was looking at. Of course, you can see that there were other things in the room that the child could also be looking at and engaged in, but the children in this study primarily would match the gaze of the experimenter. Children with autism are much less likely to be able to engage in this kind of activity, and there's actually quite a continuum on which young children will be equipped to do this. So children with autism will be very poor at this. Some very bright children might be very good at it, but there's a lot of differentiation between along this continuum. And the ability of a young child to track the eye gaze of the experimenter at 10.5 months actually predicted the size of their vocabulary when they were 2.5 years old. So like a year and a half later, they would be brought back into the laboratory, and the experimenter would see how many words that young child knew, and they would test their knowledge of different words about objects and also about mental states, like whether you feel angry or happy or whether you're confused or things like that. And the number of words that a child knew was related to their eye gaze very, very early in life, which suggests that the ability to track the experimenter's eye gaze, or any adult's eye gaze, to see what they're talking about is a huge and important key factor in being able to pick up on new words and information. However, young children also care a great deal about the source of the information. Children don't place all adults in the same category as equally trustworthy. Instead, young children will pay more attention to the adults in their life who look more like them. So, for instance, if you share the same hair color or the same skin color, then you're more likely to pay attention to those adults as a trustworthy source of information. Children are unlikely to learn words from a robot, even if those robots can move their eyes and appear to be a reliable source of information. Children will match their eye gaze, but not learn words from them because they feel like probably because it's too different from them and perhaps not a reliable source of information. And likewise, if you've demonstrated yourself to be an unreliable source of information in the past by kind of being an idiot about certain things, like calling a shoe a duck, then that suggests to a child that you aren't a reliable source of information, and they won't trust you going forward with as a potential source of learning new words. You're going to read a section in your text that describes that phenomenon.